for whatever reason. And it's hard when you dig yourself a hole against a really solid defensive team because they don't give you extra possessions very often, and they make it really hard on you. And we dug ourselves a hole, and then we started to claw back, and then...
The Indiana Fever traveled to San Francisco this week, already carrying a season's worth of frustration about how the team is being used, and it did not take long for a new controversy to attach itself to the old one.
A contusion in my leg the rest of the game, like it's ridiculous. Can't miss calls like that. Which is fine. You can't knee me in the leg, knock me over. It's hard. I think I played 10 minutes in the first half. Like it's just struggling a little bit to find a flow. And
Wednesday night's matchup against the Golden State Valkyries ended in an 88-75 loss. But the final score barely registered next to what happened in the second quarter, when a no call on a drive to the basket turned into the latest flashpoint in a running argument between Fever fans, the coaching staff, and the league's officials. The play itself was simple. Caitlin Clark drove to the rim, went up for a layup, and made contact with Valkyrie center Kiah Stokes on the way down. The shot went in, but Clark hit the floor and came up limping. No foul was called. As soon as the next whistle stopped play, Clark turned and went directly at the official, throwing her arms up before being issued a warning. She stayed in the game, finishing with 13 points, 6 assists, and 3 rebounds in 26 minutes, shooting 4 for 14 from the field and 1 for 8 from 3. Afterward, Clark did not soften her account of what happened. She said she took a knee directly to the quad, that the contact left her with a contusion she had to play through for the rest of the game, and that a hit like that should not be missable for an official standing right there. When she pressed for an explanation, she was told that she had initiated the contact herself. Her response was blunt. That explanation might be technically defensible, but it did not change the fact that she had been kneed in the leg and knocked off balance. Head coach Stephanie White was given the same explanation when reporters asked her about the play, and she did not try to hide her skepticism. She noted, with open sarcasm, that Clark always seems to be the one initiating the contact, no matter how the collision actually unfolds. White has used that same tone before. Earlier this season, after a no call and a loss to the New York Liberty, she called the officiating in Fever games egregious and said the disrespect toward her team had become impossible to ignore. The pattern she is describing is not new. It is the same argument repeated from a different city against a different opponent with the same result. A Fever loss, visibly hurt franchise player, and no whistle. There is a structural piece to this loss that goes beyond any single missed call. Golden State has built its season around exactly the kind of physical, discipline-first defense that produced Wednesday's outcome. The Valkyries have now held opponents to 75 points or fewer 12 times this season, and they are 11-1 in those games. Indiana's 75 points Wednesday fit neatly into that pattern. When a defense built to slow teams down gets the benefit of the doubt on contact plays at the rim, it becomes very difficult for a team built on pace and dribble penetration to generate the looks it needs. But for a large part of the Fever fan base, the no call is not really the story. It is the spark that reignited a much longer-running debate about how Stephanie White is using Caitlin Clark, and whether the coaching staff bears more responsibility for Indiana's inconsistent season than the referees do. That debate has been building for weeks. When Clark returned from a back injury against the Los Angeles Sparks, White limited her to 16 minutes, using short 3- and 4-minute stretches rather than allowing her to settle into a rhythm. Clark finished with 9 points on 4 for 12 shooting, and Indiana lost by 14. Clark herself said afterward that playing in 3-minute bursts made it almost impossible to find any kind of flow, adding that even though her body felt fine physically, that particular rotation pattern was one of the hardest ways for her to play the game. Fans were not shy about their reaction. Some argued that the minutes restriction had little to do with genuine injury management and everything to do with a coaching philosophy that has limited Clark's role even when she is healthy. One widely shared post after that game called for White's firing outright, arguing that using Clark as an off-ball screener rather than the offense's primary engine wasted her most obvious strength. That criticism did not appear out of nowhere. Days earlier, Indiana had ruled Clark out entirely against the Phoenix Mercury, listing the reason as rest, with White explaining that the plan had been to split the back-to-back workload between Clark and Aaliyah Boston. Clark said at the time that she felt 100% physically. The decision to sit her anyway added to a growing sense among fans that the coaching staff's caution was outpacing the medical reality, especially given how directly Clark's minutes affect the pace and shot creation of the entire offense. The minutes question is only one half of the frustration. The other half is about shape and structure. Analysts and fans alike have pointed to stretches this season where Indiana's offense has looked disjointed, with possessions bogging down into isolation basketball instead of the quick-hitting actions that let Clark operate as a shooter and passer at the same time. The preferred fix, echoed repeatedly by people watching closely, is a return to simple screen and roll and dribble handoff actions, the kind of straightforward two-man game that lets Clark attack downhill while putting her teammates in position to finish. Those sets have appeared in flashes this season but have not been used consistently, and when they disappear for stretches, the offense tends to stall. There is also a philosophical tension underneath all of this. White has spoken about wanting more egalitarian ball movement, keeping the offense flowing side to side and baseline to baseline rather than running everything through one player. Clark, by contrast, has functioned for most of her career as a heliocentric hub, the guard whose gravity and shot-making bend an entire defense around her. Reconciling those two approaches has not been simple, and the friction between them shows up on the court in the form of possessions that look indecisive, neither fully organized around Clark's strengths nor fully distributed among the rest of the roster. Fans watching that tension play out have not been quiet about where they place the blame. Some point to specific in-game decisions, like a first-quarter substitution against the expansion Portland Fire in which White pulled Clark, Lexi Hull, and Aliyah Boston simultaneously while Indiana was leading, only to watch the team collapse before the quarter ended. Others point to broader patterns across the season, arguing that the coaching staff has consistently found ways to limit Clark's role even in games where health was not a factor. The specific complaints vary, but they converge on the same conclusion, that Indiana's record this season reflects coaching decisions as much as it reflects the play of its roster, and that the team's ceiling is being capped by choices made on the bench rather than limitations on the floor. Stephanie White has pushed back on the idea that there is any deeper rift between her and her star player, describing moments of visible frustration between them as the normal byproduct of two highly competitive people trying to win. Clark has echoed that framing publicly, waving off suggestions of a personal conflict. But the on-court results have kept the coaching debate alive regardless of how either of them characterizes their relationship. A team with this much individual talent losing close games while dealing with recurring questions about rotation patterns and offensive structure is exactly the kind of pattern that keeps a fan base engaged and frustrated at the same time. Wednesday's loss to Golden State layered a new grievance on top of an existing one. The no call itself fits a pattern of officiating decisions that have gone against Indiana in high-leverage moments this season, a pattern Stephanie White has now called out publicly more than once. But the deeper frustration many fans expressed afterward was not really about one missed knee-to-leg contact. It was about a season in which the same points keep resurfacing. A star player whose minutes are managed in ways that undercut her rhythm, an offense that reverts to isolation basketball when simpler actions would suit its personnel better, and a head coach whose in-game decisions are increasingly being weighed against the results those decisions produce. None of this changes what happened on the court in San Francisco. Indiana lost by 13, fell to a defense built around exactly the kind of physicality that produced Wednesday's uncalled contact, and watched its franchise player leave the arena with a leg contusion and no whistle to show for it. What has changed is how quickly that single incident got absorbed into a larger conversation. For a growing share of Fever fans, the question is no longer just whether the officials missed a call. It is whether the coaching staff is doing everything it can to put its best player, and by extension its team, in position to win. Looking at the play itself again is useful for understanding why it generated so much reaction. Clark's drive came in the second quarter, with the Fever still within reach of the game. She beat her defender off the dribble, got into the paint, and rose for a contested finish near the rim. Stokes, contesting from the weak side, left her feet to challenge the shot, and her knee made contact with Clark's leg as both players were airborne. Clark's shot dropped, which meant the officials had no dead ball stoppage to review the contact in the moment. Play simply continued. Clark had to get back on defense while still absorbing the impact of the collision. It was only at the next whistle, well after the contact had already happened, that Clark was able to address the official directly, and by that point the game had already moved past the play in question. That sequence matters because it explains part of why the explanation Clark received afterward struck her, and White, as unsatisfying. Being told that a driving player technically initiated contact with a defender who left her feet to contest a shot is a version of events that focuses on the mechanics of the collision rather than its outcome. Clark's own response captured that distinction clearly. Whatever technically initiated the contact, the result was a knee to her leg that knocked her off balance and left her with an injury she had to play through for the remainder of the game. White's sarcastic aside that Clark always seems to be the one initiating contact was less a rebuttal of the technical explanation, and more a comment on how often that same explanation gets applied specifically to plays involving her franchise player. This is not the first time this season that White has raised that exact concern in public. After Indiana's loss to the New York Liberty, in a sequence where Natasha Cloud made contact with Clark on a game-deciding possession without a whistle, White used considerably stronger language, describing the officiating in Fever games as egregious and saying the disrespect toward her team had reached a point she could no longer stay quiet about. Sophie Cunningham was reported to have approached officials over that same no call. Taken together with Wednesday's game, it forms a pattern that White herself has now pointed to more than once. Contact plays involving Clark, in moments that matter, going uncalled. That pattern feeds directly into the coaching debate because it complicates the question of how much of Indiana's inconsistency this season is attributable to officiating and how much is attributable to decisions made on the bench. Fans who are frustrated with White's rotations have not necessarily dismissed the officiating complaints. Many of them hold both positions at once, that the Fever have absorbed a disproportionate number of unfavorable calls in high-leverage moments, and that the coaching staff has also made in-game decisions that have cost the team wins on nights when the officiating was not a factor at all. The Sparks game is frequently cited as the clearest example of the second complaint. Clark had missed 2 straight games with a back injury and was already averaging a career high in scoring for the season heading into her return. Instead of easing her back in with a normal rotation, White used her in short bursts, 3 or 4 minutes at a time, subbing her in and out repeatedly throughout the game. Clark said afterward that the stop-and-start pattern made it almost impossible to get into any kind of rhythm, and that while she appreciated the caution around her health, that specific approach to managing her minutes was one of the more difficult ways for her to play. She finished with 9 points on 4 for 12 shooting and a -16 plus misses in a game Indiana lost by 14 against a Sparks team that was missing 2 of its own key players. The response from fans was immediate and pointed. Some argued directly that White was mismanaging her best player regardless of the medical rationale, with one post after that game explicitly calling for the coach to be fired and criticizing the decision to use Clark in off-ball screening roles rather than as the offense's primary initiator. Others focused less on any single game and more on a season-long pattern, arguing that the minutes restrictions predate the back injury entirely, and that the injury has simply become a new justification for an approach that was already in place. Whether or not that broader claim is accurate, the sentiment behind it reflects a fan base that has grown skeptical of explanations tied to health management, particularly when Clark herself has repeatedly said she feels physically capable of playing more. The Mercury game added another data point to that same argument. Indiana ruled Clark out entirely, listing the reason on the injury report as rest, with White explaining that the plan had been to divide the back-to-back workload between Clark and Aaliyah Boston. Clark said publicly that she felt 100% physically heading into that game. For fans already frustrated by the Sparks rotation, sitting a healthy-feeling Clark entirely read as further evidence that decisions about her workload were being driven by coaching philosophy as much as by medical necessity. The offensive structure question runs parallel to the minutes debate, and the two are not entirely separable. Analysts who have watched Indiana closely this season have pointed to specific stretches where the offense reverts to isolation possessions, with Clark working one-on-one against a set defense rather than operating within actions designed to create advantages before the ball even reaches her. The alternative that keeps coming up, both from outside analysts and from fans themselves, is a heavier and more consistent use of simple screen and roll and dribble handoff actions, the two-man game that allows Clark to attack downhill off a live dribble while forcing defenses to make quick decisions about switching or helping. Those actions have appeared in Indiana's offense at various points this season, including stretches where the ball moved well and the team's top 3 scorers combined for a strong offensive output. But those stretches have not been sustained, and when the offense drifts away from them for extended periods, possessions tend to slow down and stall. White has described her own offensive philosophy in terms of ball movement, wanting the offense to flow side to side and end to end rather than being built entirely around one player creating for herself and others. That is a defensible coaching principle on its own terms. The tension is that Clark's greatest individual strength, the one that has defined her game since college, is exactly the kind of shot creation and gravity that comes from being used as a high-usage, ball-dominant guard. Reconciling a system built around distributed ball movement with a player whose value is maximized by touches and usage is not a simple problem, and Indiana's uneven offensive performances this season suggest that reconciliation has not been fully worked out. Individual coaching decisions in specific games have kept that frustration close to the surface. Against the expansion Portland Fire earlier this season, White substituted Clark, Lexi Hull, and Aaliyah Boston out simultaneously in the first quarter while Indiana was still leading. The team's performance fell apart almost immediately after that substitution, and Portland closed the quarter with a 14-point lead. White explained afterward that the move was a proactive step to manage the workload of her two stars, rather than a reaction to anything happening on the floor. But for fans watching a competitive lead evaporate in the minutes right after Clark left the game, the explanation did little to quiet the criticism. White and Clark have both pushed back publicly on the idea that any of this reflects a deeper personal rift. White has described visible moments of frustration between them as the ordinary byproduct of two highly competitive people working toward the same goal, and Clark has echoed that characterization, dismissing suggestions of a rift as two people being competitive rather than in conflict. Neither of them has treated the criticism as evidence of dysfunction between coach and player specifically, but that framing addresses the interpersonal question without resolving the on-court one. And the on-court results are what continue to drive the debate among fans, independent of how the coach and her star player choose to describe their working relationship. What Wednesday's game in San Francisco did was connect these threads in a single 90-minute broadcast. The no call itself extended a pattern of officiating decisions that Stephanie White has now criticized publicly more than once this season, and it left Indiana's best player playing through pain for the rest of the game. But the surrounding context, the minutes restrictions, the isolation-heavy stretches, the specific substitution patterns that have preceded losses, gave the incident a second life beyond the officiating complaint itself. For a meaningful share of the Fever's fan base, the frustration expressed after this loss was not only about a missed call in the second quarter. It was about a season in which decisions made on the bench keep drawing as much scrutiny as decisions made by the officials, and in which the gap between Indiana's talent level and its record keeps prompting the same question: whether the coaching staff is doing everything it can to put its best player, and by extension its team, in position to win.